the deity Adonai made their way into the northern hill country and made their way into the Israelite pantheon, they did so by adopting the Northwest Semitic storm deity divine profile.
In this video, Dan is seeking to support the idea that Yahweh was a god that made its way into the Israelite pantheon by adopting the Northwest Semitic storm deity profile that we see in Baal, and that Yahweh was just kind of an appropriation or an evolution out of Baal. There is a common position among some Old Testament scholars that Yahweh evolved out of Baal and Canaanite religion, or that there's some merging or some syncretism that is going on there. And Dan wants to support this idea by giving examples in which Israelites used Ugaritic text and language in their praise of Yahweh or their descriptions of Yahweh. And I want to address his video because it's a good example of good data leading to bad dogma, specifically the dogma of modern liberal Bible scholarship, which seeks to undermine the testimony of the Bible every chance it gets. So let's start with the idea of Baal imagery and language being used by the Israelite writers. Now, on this point, Dan is correct. There are numerous instances in which the imagery clearly reflects the writer using pre-existing Canaanite work or imagery. Dan cites Psalm 29, but there are many others as well, such as Psalm 24, which is one of my favorites, or Daniel 7. So while Dan is correct to know that the Israelites use Canaanite text and imagery, that data does not support the idea of Yahweh evolving from Baal or sliding his way into the Israelite pantheon, or the Israelites just copying from Canaanites or anything like that. And the reason this does not follow is that Dan has not taken into account the use of what John Currid calls polemical theology. The idea here is that the Israelite writers were using imagery that their neighbors were familiar with in order to send a theological message about who the true God is. So, for instance, when an Israelite takes a hymn describing Baal as the one who rides the clouds and instead says that Yahweh is the cloud rider, the message they are sending to their audience and their pagan neighbors is that Baal is not the one who rides the clouds. Yahweh is. It is an attack on Baal. Baal is not the king of the gods. Yahweh is. And this is a clear tactic that both God and the Israelite writers use throughout Scripture. So let's look at some quick examples. In Egyptian text, a common phrase used to describe the Pharaoh's power over his foes is in reference to his strong arm or his strong hand. Thus, when the writer of Exodus refers to the defeat of Pharaoh by Yahweh in reference to Yahweh's strong arm, he is taking the imagery and the language of the Egyptians and he is using that in a mocking, polemical way to send a message about who's really in charge, namely Yahweh. For another example, in Exodus, in Egypt, the Pharaoh's crown was an enraged serpent that symbolized the Pharaoh's power and deity. And so when Aaron threw the rod down before Pharaoh, that became a snake. The theological, polemical message was an assault on the deity and the authority of Pharaoh, and it was an assault that utilized the imagery familiar to the Egyptians. Now, Dan referenced Baal a lot in his video, and he referenced the contest between the prophets of Baal and Elijah, but he did not mention the section of that story which shows how God and the Israelites used this type of polemical theology that I've been describing. So let's look at that story in a bit more detail and see what's going on. So when Elijah first comes on the scene, he is confronting Ahab, who is the current king of Israel. Israel is at this point suffused with Baal worship and has gone astray from Yahweh, and we're told that Yahweh has been provoked because of this. And as punishment, the land comes under a drought. Now, why was a drought the curse? Because Baal is supposedly the god of rain and storms. And so by punishing them with a drought, Yahweh is making clear that it's not Baal who is in control of the rain and the storms. Yahweh is. Yahweh is essentially saying, oh, you're worshiping Baal? You think he's the god of storms and rain? Nah, I'm the god of all nature. And so as much as you pray to Baal to give you water, you won't get it. And it's after Baal is defeated in Elijah's contest that rain returns to the land. Now, this isn't just done with rain and Baal. This is also done in the Israelite plagues. Numerous amounts of Old Testament scholars have noted that the plagues which come upon the Egyptians in the Exodus story all or mostly correlate to specific Egyptian gods that were supposed to have power over those things. And so this is why we see in Exodus 12:12, God says, I'm going to execute my judgment on the gods of Egypt. He does it in a way that makes clear, all these guys you think are gods of all these things? No, I'm in charge of this. I'm in charge of the rivers and the frogs and the locusts and all these things. A number of Old Testament scholars have argued that the Genesis creation account is itself an example of polemical theology due to similarities and differences between it and other creation accounts in the ancient Near East. For an introduction to polemical theology, I would suggest looking at John Currid's work, Against the Gods, the Polemical Theology of the Old Testament. I don't agree with every point in it, but it's pretty good. Also, Mike Heiser has several good podcasts, specifically on Psalm 24 and 29 and how they use the Baal cycle, which are worth a listen. In summary, the idea put forth by Dan and other scholars does not arise from the actual data. It comes from poor assumptions that they are bringing to that data.